this is one of the great American books. And if you want to be a writer or if you want to be a scholar of American literature, you need this book in your mind. You need to know it, you need to love it, you need to have it as part of who you are. It's one of our great books. Let me give you a little biographical information. I'm a firm believer in the fact that if you know something about the writer, if you understand the context in which that writer worked, you have greater insight into the book. And even if you don't have greater insight, it's more fun to know about the writer. So, and having fun is the great pleasure of reading literature. So, let me tell you about Edith. She was born Edith Newbold Jones. She was born in New York City on West 23rd Street in a brownstone that's still there. It's on the south side between 5th and 6th. It's now a Starbucks, which is kind of ironic. Wasn't kind of the choice that she would have made, but still it's an important part of New York culture. She was born into two families that had been in this country and in fact in this city for generations and generations. She was very proud of that. Her father was George Frederick Jones and her mother was Lucretia Stevens Rhinelander Jones. And they were both members of a very small insular and patrician society. Her father, they both had money, not very much. Her father had most of the money, although her mother came into some inheritance later, but her father owned real estate in his family, so he didn't really do very much. And a lot of the people Edith knew didn't really do very much. They had money and they did stuff, but they didn't really have jobs. She said when she was young and growing up, she said, we used to have these wonderful lunch parties during the week because none of the men went to their offices. So we had lunch parties with everyone. It was just every day. It was another vacation day. So Edith's father had real estate, and he was mild and bookish and charming, and she loved him. And that he was the great source of love in her life. And he had a great private library. And Edith was not sent to school, but she was self-educated, and she read in her father's library. Now, her mother's position in her world was that Edith was not allowed to read novels because they were racy and superficial, and so that they were forbidden. It would be like letting your kid watch TV, so novels were forbidden. So she grew up reading philosophy and history of religion and biography, Gibbon, Carlyle, the great writers in European literature. So you can imagine this young, bookish girl. She had two much older brothers, living alone in this house with her mother, who was very high-strung, incredibly snobbish. I mean, there was no one in New York who was more of a snob than Lucretia. And at one point when they were in Newport, and Edith had just gotten married, she was in her carriage, and her mother was ahead of her in the street in her carriage, and she had a new coachman, Edith did, and the coachman didn't recognize her mother's carriage, and he passed it. And that was such an insult, and Edith didn't realize that until they were past the carriage. And she said to the coachman, you have to stop. You have ruined my relationship with my mother. I have to go straight to her house. And she apologized to her mother and said, I'm so sorry that we passed you by mistake. The coachman didn't recognize you. And her mother said, you should have stopped. So she had been publicly humiliated by her daughter's carriage passing hers. So she was a force to be reckoned with. And she was from the Rhinelander family, which was also a very old New York family, but they didn't have much money. So she grew up in this situation, Lucretia, in which her family was one of the great old New York families, but she had to wear a hand-me-down dress to her coming out party. She had to wear shoes that were too big. So there was this tension between who she thought she was and who she was, or who she was and who she thought she was. So Edith grew up in this world that contained these two tensions. One was the life of the mind, and the other was society. So her family she was very well born, but she wasn't born rich. Her family was not as rich as the other people in their circles. So to the outside, they would have looked extremely rich. They had the big brownstone on 23rd Street. They had a summer house in Newport. But compared to their friends, they were not rich. And so periodically, after Edith was born, the family, especially after the Civil War when the housing market fell apart, They had to rent both their houses in America and move to Europe, where it was very cheap to live at that time, and wait for the market to recover and their finances. So it was kind of shaming to have to leave because you couldn't afford to stay. So all your friends were going to Newport for the summer, and you were going to be in a spa in Germany because you couldn't afford to be in Newport. But it gave Edith a new way of looking at the world. So she grew up she was there for 3 or 4 years as a young child and then several years more as a teenager. So she grew up knowing what European cities looked like and having an extraordinary appreciation of the art and architecture of great European cities. And she came back to America and she hated New York. She said it's so ugly compared to Paris, compared to Venice, compared to Rome. Look at these rows of horrible brownstone stoops. They're just terrible. And New York's idea, the reason for the architecture in New York, there was at one point it was going to be designed like Washington with mews and bows and curves and circles, but they decided it would be more democratic if every house were the same and every block were the same. So Edith just hated it. So she had this strange childhood, which was partly very snobbish and very insular and very New Yorky, but partly slightly bohemian, in that they went off to Europe for a reason that wasn't something they were proud of. And she learned all the languages. She had a French nanny, she had a German governess later on, and she learned Italian. And she said later, in one of her classic sweeping statements, she said, I really don't know why people don't just take their children to Europe as children and they can learn all the modern languages that way. It would be so much easier than teaching them at school. So she learned all the modern languages, and she came back and she had her coming out party a year early, which was probably because of the family finances, and her father was ill. And they wanted to get Edith off the books so that because things were shaky. She came out at 17, and she was not beautiful, and she was not rich. So despite the fact that she was brilliant and a wonderful conversationalist, she did not marry for a number of years. She had an engagement to a young man who is actually hilarious, but it's too long to go into. He was from a completely different kind of family. His family were Aravistes, and he was very nice, and he'd gone to St. Paul's in Oxford, but his parents were people that Edith's parents could not tolerate, and finally the engagement was broken off. So she lost 2 years of good marriageable life, and that engagement was broken off. And then she met a man that she should have married called Walter Berry, who was a lawyer and brilliant, and she became his closest friend later in life. And he didn't ask her to marry him because he was at that point a young lawyer with no money. And they spent an idyllic summer together in Bar Harbor, Maine. And at the end of the summer, they went out in a canoe in the evening, and she waited for him to ask her the question, and he didn't. And he wrote about it later and said, I should have. Anyway, she didn't marry him. She went back to Newport. She's now 23, which is a long time to be single in her world. And she, in Newport, she meets her older brother's friend, Edward Wharton. He's 12 years older than she is. He's never had a job. He lives with his mother, and his father's in an insane asylum. So, not the perfect catch. He's also not intellectual, doesn't like to read, isn't interested in architecture or culture. But he's good-natured, and he's very fond of her, and they get married. So that's, I think, in 1885. And for a while, they're happy. They like to travel together. And then the marriage starts to break down. Edith also starts publishing during that time after she gets married, and she starts publishing poetry, then short stories. She writes a historical novel set in Italy that is published. Then she writes a book about decoration and gardens, 2 books. And increasingly, her marriage is in distress. Probably, nobody knows for sure, probably it has never been consummated. They don't have a great sex life. And Teddy is, neurasthenic is the word that they use. He sort of has mental breakdowns, he has physical breakdowns. Henry James kindly calls him cerebrally challenged. He doesn't like any of Edith's friends. She doesn't like his friends. And so in 1905, she has been publishing for about 15 years, and she writes her first contemporary novel. It's The House of Mirth. She writes it as a serial for Scribner's, and I want you to think about this for a moment, how dazzling this is. She has not finished the book when she writes the first chapter. She writes it chapter by chapter, and she cannot go back when she's finished the first draft and fix the first chapter. It's done. She sends it off. She can't go back and say, wait, he should have been there when they met, because he needs to know later on. She writes each chapter as a perfect whole piece of writing, with all the characterization, with the subtle psychological shifts, with the descriptions, the brilliant movement towards tragedy. She has all in her head before she starts. So she writes this novel in chapters, and it becomes a sensation. It becomes so popular that Scribner's has to print twice and then 3 times and then 4 times the number of magazines when her story comes out, because the whole country is waiting to hear what will happen to Lily Bard. And this makes Edith's name. So then she becomes the Edith Wharton who is famous. That's 1905. The marriage lasts for 7 more years. In 1913, she divorces Teddy, and because of the divorce laws here, she doesn't want to get divorced in this country, so she moves to France, where she has been going periodically anyway, and she spends the rest of her life in France. But let's talk about this book. One of the things for one thing, if you've looked it up ever on Wikipedia, or if you've ever read anything about it, there's a kind of a strange scholarly error about it, and there is a claim that it refers to a passage in Ecclesiastes, the title. It's not. Ecclesiastes has nothing to do with this book. It's called The House of Mirth because it means the fun house, the hall of mirrors in an amusement park. And when she wrote this, it was just at the time when the amusement parks were starting to become popular. They were just arriving, 1904, I think. So this is the Hall of Mirrors. The House of Mirth is a place that you go into and you see yourself distorted. And at first, it's funny. And it becomes increasingly frightening and finally terrifying. So that's what this image is meant to reflect. It is the society in which, at first, Lily Bard is having a wonderful time, and as she moves through the book and through this passage, it becomes increasingly terrifying. So that's what she's thinking about. And one of the reasons this book was so fascinating to so many people is, I want you to go back to a moment in our history before the Kardashians. I know that's hard to imagine, but there was such a moment. And Edith's family came from a group of people who shunned publicity. They hated being noticed. They hated having any kind of public attention brought to them. And in fact, in Edith's circle, and long later, until the 30s and 40s, a lady was never supposed to have her name in the paper except for 3 times during her life: when she was born, when she was married, and when she died. So this circle that Edith wrote about was completely inaccessible to most people. Nobody wrote about them, and if they did write about them, they were not writing from inside. They were writing as outsiders, so they didn't really know what was going on. So for Edith Wharton to be a member of the center of this extremely private Mandarin society, to write about it was fascinating. It's a bit like Downton Abbey. Everybody was dying to find out what actually happened in those bedrooms and what people said at the dinner table. So Edith is telling them what it's like, and she's also writing. It's also a great narrative, and it's a page turner as well as being one of the great American tragedies. So some of the things that are very evident in this book that are interesting to discuss are money, class, manners, gender, morality, which is a really important topic for Wharton, style, her literary style, the quality of compassion, which I believe drives all great literature, and the notion of tragedy. Well, it's impossible for us to read precisely into Wharton's intentions, but certainly there are men in her life that let Wharton down. Her father was, by all accounts, rather weak. She had this engagement with a man called Harry Perrin Stevens, and he was unbelievably rich. His mother was a nightmare, and his father died. He inherited the money, but he wouldn't inherit the money until he was 25 or married. So guess what his mother did not want was to have him be married. So she breaks up the engagement. So that's Edith's first encounter, and by all accounts it was a happy engagement. They were engaged for 2 years and spent much of their time together. That's taken away from her. Then Walter Berry does not ask her to marry him. Teddy Wharton is a complete failure, and the reason she finally divorces him is that he's not only crazy, but he also has embezzled her trust funds to buy an apartment for his mistress in Boston. So she said, okay, that is really enough. So her life, in terms of relationships with men, has been a string of failures. And I wouldn't say so she could only write this book, but it's true that she hasn't had in her life a series of models of men who have stepped forward. And Selden is a really confusing figure because he doesn't do the right thing. He doesn't step up. He isn't a man of great agency. He's a man of enormous magnetic presence, and Lily admires him for everything he does. But each time there's a moment in which he can step in and save Lily, he chooses to step back. And it's incredibly frustrating. The more you read this book, the more frustrated you get, particularly the moment when Selden comes at night towards the Trements' house and he sees Lily step out into the darkness, and he thinks that she has spent the evening with Gus Trenor in a compromising relationship, and he leaves. He says, I can't sully my hands with this situation. I don't want to compete. So he is not the man we want him to be. And in fact, so who is the hero in this book? Is there a hero? Is there anyone close to a hero? Okay, let's talk about Sim Rosedale. What about Sim Rosedale? What about class? What about snobbery? What about the fact that he's Jewish? What part does he play in this book? Not just money. It's what he's interested in is social upward mobility. He wants to get into the circle that Lily's in the center of. And so in the beginning, she is the insider and he is the outsider. Yeah. And as the book progresses, he becomes the insider and she's the outsider. He comes in and carries his cane into the living room because Gus Trenor does it, and she says it's just so offensive that you should never carry your cane into the living room. But he does it just to imitate people who are more socially comfortable than he is. But he, as his character is revealed, he becomes more and more interesting as a character, and he is the only man who offers real help to Lily Bart. He wants nothing in exchange. First he says, give me the letters, we'll go after Bertha. If we get Bertha to restore you in social standing, then I will marry you. And she says, I'm not blackmailing. And in that period, blackmailing was an absolutely forbidden sin. It's one of the worst crimes you can commit, morally. It's a terrible thing to do. She says, I'm not doing it. Even at the cost of my own destruction, I will not commit that moral stain on my soul. And then he says, can I visit you? He's the only person who's offered to visit her. And Selden, exactly. Where are you? Doesn't even come to visit her. And then he says, I will give you money. Can I help you? And she says, even if you gave me money, it would still be a debt from me to you, and I can't have any more debts. So Rosedale, who is somebody who starts out as somebody we enjoy dismissing, really turns into the only man of substance in the book. Much as we love Selden, we admire him, we love his books, we love his little tea set, but he doesn't step forward to rescue Lily. He doesn't say the word. He comes later and he doesn't ever say the word. So that's a really important question that is central to all of Wharton's books, actually. And it has a lot to do with this, with her Puritan background. this feeling of repression, this feeling of withholding, and this feeling of renunciation, so that often in her books the characters cannot connect. She will not permit it, because she is part of a tradition of Puritan ethics that simply forbid it. And it's deeply frustrating for the readers. Lily knows he's going to use this information against her, and that's her first mistake. And the mistake she makes is not admitting to her true wishes, to her authentic self. Her authentic self didn't mind going up and having that cup of tea. And by the way, tea, curiously enough, is what people have in hot countries. It comes from hot countries. And people in India have hot tea. Don't ask me why. It's supposed to cool you off, but I'm just saying. So she's perfectly happy to go upstairs into a bachelor's apartment, which is, you have the sense that it's slightly risque. It's a little bit, people would look askance at it, but it's not terrible. It's in the afternoon. She's only there a short while. But she doesn't want to admit that to Sim Rosedale, who's an outsider. She doesn't want to give him anything on her, so she lies. And with that first step away from authenticity, she puts herself at risk, and she starts on this slope of denying her own authenticity that never ends. And each time she moves in that direction, taking money from Gus Trenner, she goes on the yachting trip in order to mask her friend's adultery. All these things she does which move her away from her own moral core, which is something she never really talks about or thinks about, but we know that she has it because in the end, that's what she cleaves to. But what Wharton is really doing is writing about this question of authenticity and a moral core. And for Wharton, that's essential. The moral core of a human being is essential. And so in some ways, this book is about the difference between a moral core of an individual set against a society. And honestly, Wharton makes the society look fascinating and terrible, and we all love to hate it. But any society you're in is challenging. If you pick corn, that society is really difficult, and people get divorced and they have terrible fights. I mean, any life that you lead is going to be very challenging. So she's in a situation that puts enormous pressures on her, and she really can't withstand it. But she has, at her core, a moral, a place of morality, and when worst comes to worst, she finds that place. It's so fascinating to me, the idea that she wrote these perfect chapters one after another, and then they're all published together. So, I mean, Trollope, for example, I'm absolutely certain that in some of his books he starts out thinking that the woman really did forge the letter, the signature at the end of the letter, and by the end of the book you think, I think he changed his mind halfway through. I think now he thinks she didn't forge the letter. So there was no time for her to change her mind. It does start out in Selden's mind, and so you do expect it to go back to him at the end. Well, it does go back to him at the end. He comes and finds her. But there is never that sense of close connection that we want, and I think that's part of Wharton's sensibility. She couldn't bring herself. She also didn't know it, but we can't assume that just because it wasn't in her own life she couldn't imagine it. But it certainly wasn't present in her life. There is a kind of rage in Wharton against Lily. I mean, Lily is punished, I think, in this book. She starts out so high, so fine, so beautiful, so perfectly prepared, so much in command, and she ends in such disarray and destitution and without anything. And Wharton made this happen. One of the things that feels to me as though it's present in the book, and I don't know what drove her to do it, but I enjoy thinking about it. So I think that she did feel, she may have felt a kind of rage at being trapped herself in a marriage that was increasingly unhappy for her. She was trapped in a society that she escaped to France, where intellectual women are treated very differently from the way they were treated in this country at that time. She created a wide circle of intellectual friends when she was there. Her life changed completely. But when she was in New York, no one she knew read books. No one she knew was a writer. She knew some friends in Boston. She said, in Boston I was considered too sophisticated and rich, and in New York I was considered too writerly and intellectual. And so nobody would talk to her in either city. So she did, I think she felt trapped and constricted. I think she was also enraged at the fact she wasn't beautiful. She just wasn't. And Lily is so beautiful, and we hear that over and over again. And so I can't help but wonder about a woman who wants an attribute so deeply and who punishes a woman who has it. Louis Auchincloss, who was a Wharton scholar, said that she would have given every book she ever wrote to look like Lily Bart. I don't know that that's true, but it's, there is a sense, to me, there's a sense of punitive attack against Lily, because she isn't a villain, she isn't vicious, she never intends to do any harm to other people, and yet we watch her be destroyed. Somewhere inside her, she actually can't, she would be betraying herself if she married Percy Gryce. And that's something she doesn't allow herself to think, because she believes that as a woman in these circles, her job is to marry Percy Gryce, and she can't actually admit to herself that that would be a terrible betrayal of herself. But the question of the overdose is, and there's a letter that was discovered a few years ago that threw all Wharton scholars into a tizzy, because it was a letter that Wharton wrote to her own doctor saying, what should I have a character that I have to kill off at the end of a book. What should she take? So everybody is saying now, what does that mean? I have to kill her off. Does that mean she killed herself, or does that mean Wharton, she just was an overdose? So everybody has parsed that letter, and he tells her what it is. It's chloral hydrate or whatever she takes. But I think you can argue it both ways. I mean, the thing that is most powerful for me is the fact that whether or not she means to take an overdose. First of all, one of the things that drives suicides is the fact that they cannot bear to wake up in the morning. That's the one thing they don't want to do. They're not actually thinking of dying necessarily. They simply don't want to go through this one more day. So she is really resisting consciousness because it's too terrible. So that is an argument for saying that she committed suicide. But the thing that is more important, it seems to me, is the fact that she settles all of her accounts. She goes back over her life. She looks at the parts of it that made her happy. She settles her accounts, and so she has reached a kind of a moral equilibrium and a moral state of calm. And she's reached that place that Wharton wanted her to reach from the very beginning, and that she has been resisting her whole life. So for me, that feels like redemption, although it's a very unhappy ending. She encounters Nettie, and this is a reflection on an earlier moment in Lily's life, and she realizes how heedless she has been. It was when she had some money, I think it was from Gus Trenor. She hands this money off and to the women in the, whatever it is, the workhouse, to help them. And then she realizes when she sees Nettie again how incredibly powerful this small gesture that she had made with just an offhand gesture, just pulling some bills out of her pocketbook and giving them. And it had actually saved this woman's life. And she had been a fallen woman. She had I think she'd had a child, or she'd had a relationship before, and her husband forgave her, and she now has this idyllic working class household, and she has the baby. And so Lily, who has been thrown so far outside her own circle, so far outside. Remember that domestic scene of Lawrence Selden's library, the smell of the old books, the Morocco, the scent of the flowers on the porch outside, her sense of wishing so much that she had a place like that. I can't live alone, I can't have this, I can't be on my own. And now she sees another vision of a life that she's never going to have. Nettie is poor, she's been working all day, she comes in, she lights the fire, her husband's going to come home, and she has this baby. And the description of the baby, which is then echoed as Lily drifts into drug-induced oblivion, is one of the most moving things in the book, I think. And I've actually seen the page that she wrote that, and she changed a few words, she shifted the baby, moved the baby in her arms, she felt the weight of it. And that moment in which she describes something that she will never have is one of tremendous poignance, and it illuminates Lily's life, in which she's been driving herself in one direction, when all the while something that's so powerful and so emotionally present and valuable has been something she never even thought about, and now she will never have it. So that sense of, again, the sense of renunciation, the sense of the inability to reach something that you long for, is a very powerful presence in Wharton's books. And you and I talked about it beforehand, that, and it's present in the Age of Innocence. It's this sense of the impossibility of the true connection and the pain that impossibility evokes. And I think Wharton sees life as being split by a chasm that we're unable to reach across. And what she's brilliant at is describing what's on the other side. Let's talk about the notion of tragedy. Somebody said that this is a novel of manners. I would disagree with that. The novel of manners is a phrase that is generally used to describe a novel that is focused on a social world, and by definition it's superficial, and it's satiric, it's often light, funny, frivolous, and I would argue that this is not at all that kind of book. And let's talk about whether or not we think it's a tragedy. So the question is, does she create a character whose investment is so powerful, and one whose steps we've watched as she goes down the mountain? And have we become so engaged to believe that her entire path was inevitable, because that's part of tragedy as I see it. It's a sense of inevitable, the path to destruction. So are we engaged by it? Do we believe it's inevitable? And do we find that it's moving, that it's worthwhile? You could argue, I might argue, that Wharton is now saying, at this point in Lily's life, she is becoming desperate. She is realizing that her choices are fewer and fewer, and she is, the pace has increased. She's driven further and further into this world. And she makes some choices when the tableau vivant is being set up. She decides to go as a particular painting in which it's a portrait of a woman who is basically wearing a sheet, a clingy sheet. It's like a wet t-shirt contest, and she's decided to go into it. And she does that, and she's aware that it's actually a little extreme, that maybe this wasn't quite the right picture to choose, but she can't resist it. And she is beautiful, so she knows that the way she will look is brilliant. But Selden looks at her and says, she's gone too far. She is presenting herself as a product. She is showing too much of herself, and she has no protection. She has no man who will guard her reputation. So, and she's already put herself in Gus Trenner's hands, unintentionally, but she's done it. And so Gus Trenner can say afterwards to Selden, "Gad, did you see Lily in that dress? Not a line on her," or something like that, meaning that you can basically see her naked body underneath the sheet or whatever it was. And so again, what Lily has done is to push Selden away by this action. He withdraws from her in distaste at her showing herself off too much, and by Trenner's coarse comment. So I would argue that tableau vivant scene, which is wonderfully constructed, so what it's meant to do is to reveal European culture. These are women who are taking the position of great paintings, and so it's meant to meant to honor European culture, but what Lily does is something actually rather vulgar, and she presents herself as a body, and she knows she shouldn't do it, and she does it, and the punishment is Gus Trenor alone in that house. So there is, to me, a sense of punishment that sort of walks through this book, and the choices that Lily makes, the poor ones, are accompanied by this tread, this drumbeat of the approach of ruin. So we're almost finished. I just want to draw your attention to the flawless nature of this writing. You can choose any sentence and you can use it as the beginning of an essay. The choice of words is perfect. She's funny, she's brilliantly smart, she's derisive, she's charming. The description of the people in the social circles, the Rushforths who made bad marriages every second generation, and their cousins wouldn't marry them because they were crazy, and she's brilliant. So she's satirical, but she's also compassionate. So even though she blames Lily, and we've all been talking about blame and guilt, there is a sense in this book, for me, of deep compassion for Lily. And so when we first encounter her, she is somebody who is, as we've said, she's confident, she's beautiful, she's in charge, and she's also on the edge. And as soon as we start learning about her perilous state and the struggle that she's undertaking to keep from going over, she becomes more interesting, more engaging, and our sense of compassion and empathy is evoked. So for me, this book would not proceed with such power if I didn't feel compassion for Lily. She's the center, she's deeply flawed, and that's one of the descriptions of tragedy, is a hero with a fatal flaw in his character. It's usually a man. And that fatal flaw appears over and over throughout the text, and it's that which we come to know and understand and to expect when there's another moment when a decision has to be made and that character will make the wrong decision. And you're now invested and you're saying, don't do it, don't do that, don't go to Gus Trenor's house. But so there's this sense of Lily making choices that she shouldn't, but also we've also heard that she's innocent, she never meant this. This is a book about betrayal. There are so many moments in this book in which Lily is betrayed by the people who not necessarily should be supporting her, but Bertha Dorset is a witch. The moment in which she says, Miss Bard is not going back to the yacht, that's one of the most devastating moments in literature. She is alone, she has nothing, she is ashore, she doesn't even have her clothes. And Bertha Dorset cuts her off. And her cousin won't allow her to stay in the hotel. So you have this sense of a woman who seems to be in complete control, who is betrayed. Her aunt betrays her at the reading of the will. It's another great moment. So Selden betrays her when he sees her coming out of Gus Trenor's house at night. So she is a woman who is both flawed, struggling, and betrayed. And you have the sense that there is no other way for this book to end unless Lawrence were a superhero, which turns out he is not. She couldn't write a superhero. She doesn't write heroes. They aren't in her books. So one other thing to consider with this book is that it's written at a moment in Wharton's life when she is deeply frustrated by this society in which she grew up, and she rages at it. She says that people are superficial and cheap and money is everything, and there is no good in it. Really, there's almost no good in it. There's only one friend she has. So that's 1905. She divorces Teddy, moves to Europe, and then the war comes, and she stays in France during World War I, which is a terrible thing to go through. And at the end of the war, she's stunned by, the people are broken. She ran relief efforts. She was heroic. She was given a medal by France because she was so heroic in trying to save people and help people. At the end of that, she realizes that the world that she had grown up in, the one that she took apart in the House of Mirth, is gone. All those people that she remembered so well are dead, and that society, she thinks New York at that time was a nightmare. She had no idea what it was become, but she looks back at it from 1920 after the war, and she says, that world that I grew up in the 1880s, not 1905, was in fact a place where the community protected the individual, protected the family. So the story in the Age of Innocence is about a man who is prevented by the community from leaving his wife. It's a community that protects the idea of family. And you can argue it however you want, but there is something that's very powerful and compelling about a community that says the family is at the heart of things. It's essential. And she writes to a friend while she's writing The Age of Innocence, I have been spending my time in the last century, and it is like spending time in a great cathedral. So her view of this society had completely changed. So I urge you to read both of these books and to get very different sensibilities of the way she saw her own society. But I'll say one last thing about the way to look at this book. Two things. One is the question I ask of great writing is that it engaged me on three levels: intellectual, emotional, and aesthetic. And for me, this book does all three of those things. I find it brilliantly engaging intellectually, emotionally. It's very, very, I had a student who read it last year and he said, why didn't you tell me not to finish it out in public? Why did you tell me to read it at home, the ending? So I think it's incredibly moving, and aesthetically, it's a work of art. I just want to talk about tragedy, and so one of the things about tragedy is this notion of the fatal flaw and the question of catharsis. Does the hero find any self-knowledge? We usually ask her that. And Lily has a fatal flaw. She creates her own fate. I believe she does find redemption. She does understand herself at the end. But one of the things I want you to remember about this book is she is one of the few women up until now who creates her own fate. And we have seen tragic heroines. We have seen Emma Bovary. We have seen Anna Karenina. Their fates were shaped by men. Lily creates her own fate. She stands alone against the sky. She is like Lear. This entire book depends on her actions alone. So what Wharton has done is create a great hero who is a female. And she's one of the first to do that. Thank you all for coming.